She won't last a week. That's what Dr. Hargrove said in the cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. He hadn't looked up from his coffee. The residents around him laughed on command, the way residents do when the chief of surgery makes a pronouncement. Katie Morrison's hand froze halfway to her cup. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just kept moving, just kept breathing, the way you do when you've learned that staying invisible is survival. But what Hargrove didn't know, what nobody at that hospital knew, was that the woman they were betting against had held the northern checkpoint at Sanjin for 18 hours with nothing but a rifle and a prayer. The truth hadn't surfaced yet. It was still 3 months away from walking through those doors. What happened next changed everything. 3 months. That's how long Katie Morrison had been moving through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU corridors, and in that time she'd become someone the other nurses noticed in the way you notice water, present, essential, easy to overlook. The fluorescent lights bounced off the polished floors in long rectangles of white that made her squint, but she'd learned not to complain. Antiseptic smell. Blood underneath. The particular cold of a hospital at night that seeped through scrubs no matter how many layers you wore. The ICU at Houston's Oak Creek Memorial ran on a skeleton crew after sunset, and Katie preferred it that way. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions. Fewer moments where someone might recognize something in her face that she'd spent 7 years learning to hide. She was on day shift that Tuesday morning when the trauma call came through, and her body moved before her mind caught up. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. For down the corridor toward Trauma Bay 3. The attending physician was already there, a younger man named Chen who trusted his hands but second-guessed his instincts. 38-year-old male, motorcycle versus delivery truck at the corner of West Park and Fondren, multiple lacerations, possible pneumothorax, vitals unstable. Katie was pulling the central line kit before anyone asked. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Ultrasound probe. The way the light caught the needle's tip as she prepped the site, she'd seen that angle 1,000 times before, in a different life, when people called her by different names. "We need access," Chen said. He was the kind of doctor who stated the obvious when he was nervous. Katie didn't respond. She was already counting the intercostal spaces, her fingers finding the anatomical landmarks the way a musician finds strings in the dark. The needle went in. The sensation traveled up her arm like an old memory. 30 seconds later she had the catheter placed, blood flowing, pressures equalizing. Chen stared at her with the look they all got eventually, the look that said he couldn't quite place what he'd just witnessed. Competence had a sound, apparently. It sounded like silence. It sounded like a procedure that should have taken 90 seconds and took 45. That's when Hargrove had walked in. The chief of surgery didn't announce himself. He simply appeared in the bay doorway the way authority appears in spaces, sudden, displacing the air around him. Hargrove had been running Oak Creek Memorial's surgical department for 20 years, and those 2 decades had calcified into something hard. He was tall, the kind of tall that made rooms feel smaller, with silver hair styled with precision and a white coat that never wrinkled. Behind him came the usual entourage, 2 residents, a medical student, the attending from ortho who always deferred to him even though they were technically peers. He glanced at the patient. Then his eyes moved to Katie, and she felt the weight of that gaze the way you feel pressure changes before a storm. "Who placed this line?" Hargrove asked. Not a question, really. An interrogation. "I did," Chen said quickly. Too quickly. Hargrove moved closer to the central line site, studying it with the expression of someone examining someone else's work for flaws. Katie kept her attention on the monitor. Blood pressure climbing. Oxygen saturation climbing. The metrics that mattered. Her jaw was set the way it got when she was calculating distances and angles, but her hands were steady. They were always steady. "Clean insertion," Hargrove said finally. He wasn't talking to Chen. He was talking about Katie, but he was talking to the residents, and that was the point. That was always the point with men like Hargrove. He turned back toward the doorway. "Let me know when surgery's ready." This one needs a chest tube. Then he was gone, his entourage trailing after him like water following the current. Katie exhaled once. That was all. One measured breath that nobody was watching for. The thing about hierarchies was that they required constant maintenance. Hargrove had built his kingdom on a very simple principle, that his authority was not just legitimate but inevitable, that his decisions moved through Oak Creek Memorial like gravity, a natural, unquestionable, absolute. He'd spent 2 decades cultivating board members, investing in fundraisers where he could mention his contributions, building a network of surgeons who understood that when Hargrove suggested something, it was wise to listen. The surgical department ran on his rhythm. Residents deferred to him. Attending physicians checked their instincts against his opinions. And nurses knew their place. Until one arrived who didn't seem to know she had one. Hargrove first noticed it during Tuesday's morning briefing. Katie was reviewing the ICU intake charts, her head down, her voice quiet when she reported vitals. But there was something in the precision of her language. Not the deferential stammering of most nurses reporting to the chief. Not the careful hedging that acknowledged that she was, technically, beneath his rank. She reported facts. Clean facts. Numbers without apology. When Hargrove asked a question about a post-op patient's fluid balance, she answered with the exactness of someone who'd studied the problem, not someone who'd looked it up because a doctor had asked. He made a mental note. Noted it the way a predator notes a weakness in a fence. The real problem became clear when Hargrove discovered she'd been at Oak Creek for nearly 3 months without his approval. Not that approval mattered anymore, HR handled hiring now, another indignity of modern hospital administration, but Hargrove had never met her. She'd slipped into the ICU quietly, efficiently, and apparently without ever requiring his validation. Some of the residents had mentioned her to him in passing. The new nurse is solid with central lines. She talked Chen through a femoral access yesterday. She's good. Good. As if competence at this level was something that could be granted by apprenticeship, by observation, by simply doing the work well. As if you could build expertise the way other people built it, through hours and hands and the kind of accumulated knowledge that came from somewhere besides a hierarchy's blessing. On Thursday, Hargrove called a surgical team meeting in the conference room. 23 people. Residents, attending physicians, nurse supervisors, the anesthesia director. The room had that sterile fluorescent brightness that made everyone look tired. Hargrove sat at the head of the table, which wasn't technically the head but had become the head because that's where he sat today. Katie was standing in the back, the way ICU nurses did during meetings, ready to excuse herself if a monitor alarmed. "We've got some new staff," Hargrove began. He was in the mood for theater. Katie could hear it in the way he modulated his voice. "And I'm always interested in how integration goes. Sometimes people arrive with the wrong assumptions about how we do things here." He was looking at her now. Not directly, but the way a hunter looks in the direction of movement. "I give people a week to find their rhythm. If they haven't figured it out by then." He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "They usually move on." He paused. "Let the weight settle. In fact, I'm willing to put money on it." "The new ICU nurse?" He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room, toward Katie. "She'll be gone in a week. I'll buy drinks for anyone who witnesses her resignation." He looked at the residents. They laughed. Residents always laughed when the hierarchy told them it was permissible. Katie's hand was holding the edge of a chair. Her knuckles were white. The tremor that lived in her left hand when it was idle had found its way into her fingers, but she stopped that by moving. She picked up a clipboard that was sitting on a nearby counter. She adjusted papers that didn't need adjusting. She did anything that required her hands to have purpose, because purpose kept the shaking at bay. She didn't flinch. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't do anything except continue breathing, continue existing, the way you do when you understand that the only winning move is to not play. But inside her chest, something shifted. Something that had been dormant for 7 years stirred like it was waking from hibernation. The colonel arrived at 1900 hours Thursday evening, carried off a military transport helicopter on a stretcher, unconscious, his chart marked with a classification seal that made civilian doctors nervous. Traumatic brain injury sustained in operational theater. IED strike. 27 years old. All the chart said after that was redacted, just a wall of black marker over details that nobody was cleared to know. His name was listed as E. Colonel J. His unit was listed as E classified. His emergency contact was labeled no foreign nationals, which meant his entire life was classified down to who could know that he mattered. Katie was the one who received him into Bay 6 of the ICU. The colonel was pale, his skin the color of old snow. Military short hair. A scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw, older than the injury that had brought him here, the kind of scar that had stories attached that he'd probably never tell. He had the build of someone who'd spent decades training his body into a weapon, shoulders that seemed too broad for the stretcher, arms with muscle definition that came from pull-ups and rock climbing, and the kind of functional strength that civilians rarely saw outside of documentaries. Katie didn't recognize him. She wouldn't have recognized him anyway, 7 years of separation, the weight of trauma and recovery between them. But when she was wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm, she noticed it. She noticed because these things stick with you. Because some marks never fade. On his left forearm, just above the wrist, in black ink that had faded slightly over time, was a tattoo. 6 letters. The letters of her name. Katie. That's what it said. Katie, in military standard letters, the kind of lettering they taught you in basic training when you were learning how to mark things that belong to you. She froze. Not visibly. Not in any way that would have registered to the trauma nurses who were still hooking up monitors and calling for labs. But internally, in the place where she kept all the things she'd learned not to show, something broke open. She had no idea how his name got on his forearm. She had no idea what operational theater meant, what classified meant, what the redacted sections of his chart contained. She had no idea, in that moment, that the man lying unconscious in front of her had seen her face for the last time through a rifle scope, had watched her hold a checkpoint against the tide, had screamed her name into the Sanjin dust because he thought she was dead. All she knew was her own name, written in ink on a stranger's arm. All she knew was that time had done something impossible. It had brought someone back. The colonel's eyes didn't open. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that couldn't push for themselves. His monitor showed a steady sinus rhythm, a heart that was still working despite everything it had survived. Katie documented his vitals in the chart. ICU intake assessment. No acute distress at this moment. Awaiting neurology consult. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about muscle memory, it held you up when nothing else could. Her hands were steady, and that was enough to let her keep working. But her eyes kept returning to the forearm. To her name. To the mystery of how anyone from Sanjin could have followed her all the way to Houston without either of them knowing the other was here. She'd been told, explicitly and by people who had the authority to make such declarations, that she was erased. That the operation was buried. That she needed to disappear so completely that not even the truth could find her. And yet, here was her name, tattooed on a man who couldn't remember her face. What happened next would change everything, but not yet. First there was the waiting. First there was the work. First there was the bet Hargrove had made in that conference room, the one that said Katie Morrison didn't have the resilience to survive a week. First there was the week itself, which hadn't even started yet, but which was already moving toward her like a storm front. Katie Morrison went to her locker at the end of shift. She hung her badge on its hook. She stared at the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one thing she'd kept from Sanjin, the only physical proof that her previous life had been real. Her hands were shaking now. The tremor had returned, the one that usually only came when she was alone, in the dark hours when nobody could witness it. She pressed her palm against the cool metal of the locker and breathed. 1 week. That's what Hargrove had given her. 1 week to prove that she didn't belong. She had no idea yet that 1 week would be just the beginning. That the Colonel's classification would unlock doors that were supposed to stay sealed. That her name, written in tattoo ink, was about to become the hinge on which the entire truth turned. She had no idea. But her body knew. The way it always knew. The way it had learned, after everything, to feel danger before her mind could catch up. Monday morning arrived with the smell of industrial-strength antiseptic and fresh coffee that nobody had time to drink. Katie pushed a medication cart down the 5th-floor corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, moving with the kind of invisible efficiency that made her presence felt only when something went wrong. Her scrubs were crisp, she'd pressed them at 5 in the morning before her shift, the way she'd learned to press field uniforms in tents where wrinkles could mean the difference between being spotted and staying alive. The habit had never left her. Neither had the instinct to be ready before anyone asked. The surgical team was gathered at the nurse's station. She saw them before they saw her. Dr. Hargrove stood in the center of their orbit, as he always did, holding something between 2 fingers like it was contaminated. Her scrubs from yesterday's double shift. Morrison. His voice carried the particular weight of a man who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of command through humiliation. These are wrinkled. This isn't a field hospital. We have standards. The medication cart stopped. Katie's hands didn't shake. They never did. But she felt the eyes of 6 residents, 2 attendings, and a nurse practitioner settle on her like weight, each one waiting to see if the new girl would break. She took one measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. The breath moved through her like a tactical reset, something she'd learned in Sanjan Valley, in moments where the wrong reaction meant friendly fire. Then she met Hargrove's gaze, and something very small happened inside her chest. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye. Just one. She didn't let it fall. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, still holding eye contact, her voice level as a horizon line. Standards are why I iron my scrubs before every scheduled shift, doctor. Yesterday wasn't scheduled. A pause. I worked 16 hours. Then I went home. Then I slept. Then I came back. The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor from the ICU 3 units down, beeping with mechanical certainty. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His fingers crushed the scrub's fabric a fraction tighter. He wanted to see her flinch. He wanted to see her apologize. He wanted to see the confidence crack like cheap drywall. Instead, Katie simply waited, hands folded over the medication cart, watching him with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. It was the calm of someone who'd held a pressure dressing on a man's femoral artery while rounds were coming in. The calm of someone who'd walked 3 miles through hostile territory carrying 240 pounds of unconscious Delta Force colonel and didn't need permission to breathe. He turned and walked away. The residents dispersed like they'd never been there. Katie continued down the corridor with the medication cart, and nobody mentioned the scrubs again. But that wasn't the end of it. Wednesday morning, Katie was called into a formal performance review. Conference Room B. 3 board members she'd never seen before, their names embossed on leather portfolios. Hargrove sat at the head of the table with a file an inch thick. He presented it like evidence at trial, each page a fabricated concern. Charting inconsistencies that didn't exist. Unauthorized treatment decisions that were actually standing orders signed by the attending physician 2 years before she arrived. A patient complaint from a name she couldn't verify, supposedly about pain management delays that happened on a shift when she'd been in the ICU with a code blue. Katie sat across from them, hands folded, and went through each allegation with calm precision. Timestamps. Witness names. Medical record numbers. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. One of them kept glancing at the time. But Hargrove had cultivated these relationships for decades, country club dinners, charitable galas, the kind of social architecture that made professional loyalty feel personal. They thanked her for her thorough responses. They assured her this was just due diligence. They promised to follow up if anything required clarification. Then they deferred to Hargrove's seniority, his 2 decades of institutional knowledge, his position as chief of surgery. She was dismissed before they finished their coffee. The anonymous complaints to the hospital administrator started arriving with precision. 1 on Tuesday. 1 on Thursday. 1 on Friday morning. All referencing Katie's unauthorized treatment decisions. All originating from the same IP address in Hargrove's office. The administrator was a middle manager type, the kind who saw complaints as liability vectors and never thought to ask why an accomplished surgeon might file accusations anonymously about a nurse who'd been there 3 months. Friday afternoon, Katie sat alone in the cafeteria, pushing food around a tray she wasn't hungry for. The lunchroom smelled like industrial chicken and the ghost of something fried an hour ago. She was thinking about the colonel in the ICU, the way his pupils were responding slowly to light, the way his chart said TBI, traumatic brain injury, classified operation, found 6 months ago with no memory. She was thinking about how you could look at someone you'd bled beside, someone whose name was tattooed on your arm in a language they'd never spoken, and not know your own face. Hargrove entered through the opposite door. 2 attendings followed him, junior men, both still building their careers, both dependent on his recommendation letters. He moved toward the condiment station near Katie's table, gesturing as if reaching for salt. His elbow came back in a smooth arc that knocked the tray clean off the table. Food scattered across the tile floor, mashed potatoes, green beans, the chicken, glass smashing, silverware clattering like spent casings. He pointed down at the mess, smiling at the attendings like they were sharing something. "Pick that up, sweetheart." The cafeteria was full enough that people noticed. Quiet enough that people could watch. Katie stood slowly. 1 measured breath. The same breath. Not a sigh. Not a tremble. A reset. A tactical pause in the middle of hostile territory. She let a single tear form at the corner of her eye, not from pain, not from shame, but from something much colder. Restraint. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact and felt her voice drop half an octave. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor. Some of them even survived." She knelt on the tile floor and began collecting the scattered food. Potatoes first. Then the chicken. The vegetables scattered across a 3-foot radius. Broken glass went into a napkin, handled with the precision of someone who'd cleared broken equipment from a Humvee after IED strikes. Behind her, she heard Hargrove laugh, that particular sound that men like him make when they think they've won. He hadn't. But that wasn't the moment where victory arrived. That evening, the hospital administrator received the 3rd anonymous complaint of the week. Same IP address. Same language about unauthorized treatment decisions. Same request for immediate investigation. The administrator forwarded it to Human Resources, who forwarded it to the chief nursing officer, who added it to Katie's personnel file without reading the earlier complaints closely enough to notice the pattern. At 1900 hours Friday night, the colonel arrived by military transport. His chart identified him as Colonel James Rivera, medical retirement pending, TBI from classified operation, next of kin 1 daughter, age 12, residing in Delaware. The transport team was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from classified protocols and security clearances. They brought him in through the trauma entrance, bypassing the main ICU. Hargrove appeared within minutes, reviewing the chart with the intensity of a chess player studying a board he'd already memorized. "Morrison," he called out, not even looking up from the paperwork. "This one's yours. Full care protocol." Katie approached the bed and felt something in her chest shift like a tectonic plate. The colonel lay unconscious, his respiration shallow, his left arm exposed. On the forearm, in black ink that had faded to the color of old storm clouds, was a tattoo, K. Morrison. Below it, coordinates she could read without focusing, 34.8505 degrees north, 67.2521 degrees east, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The coordinates of the extraction point. Her hands didn't shake. They'd been trained better than her mind. She took his vitals, blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 88, respirations 14, and felt the steady professional part of her brain separate from the part that was trying not to breathe. The colonel's pupils were dilated, responding slowly to light. The surgical scars on his chest were hasty work, field sutures, done under fire, by someone who knew that perfect technique didn't matter if you were operating in a firefight. Someone who'd prioritized speed over precision because a man was dying. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and felt the unit patch inside the lining, faded, embroidered Delta Force insignia and coordinates that matched the ones on his arm. The colonel didn't respond to her voice. Didn't track her movements. The traumatic brain injury had taken whatever memory existed in the circuits connecting his eyes to his voice. He was looking at her and seeing nothing because his brain was still somewhere in a cave system east of San Jin, still trapped in the moment before the IED detonated, still locked in the hour he'd lost to combat and concussion and the particular darkness that followed. At 2100 hours, his daughter arrived. Melissa Rivera was 12 years old, traveling alone with a military escort, a second lieutenant who'd been instructed to get her to the hospital and then disappear into the classified architecture that surrounded whatever her father had been doing in Afghanistan. She was small like her father was lean, serious like someone who'd already learned that the world wasn't kind to children who asked questions. She stood in the doorway of his room with her overnight bag in one hand and looked at Katie with eyes that had learned to assess threat levels at an age when most children were still negotiating bedtime. "Are you taking care of my dad?" Melissa's voice was steady. "Older than 12. Katie nodded. "Then you're the first one who hasn't looked scared." It was the simplest statement, and it contained everything. Melissa pulled a chair to the bedside and didn't leave. She sat with her hands folded on her lap, watching her father breathe, and Katie understood in that moment that this was a child who'd already lost him once. That she was watching for the moment it happened again. At midnight, Katie noticed the subtle shift in his vitals. The jugular venous distension increasing. The blood pressure dropping, 114/70. Then 110/68. The kind of decline that was imperceptible to someone doing hourly checks but obvious to someone trained to see the difference between stable and deteriorating. The attending physician had rounded at 2200 and found nothing concerning. But Katie had lived long enough in fields where minutes meant the difference between rescue and retrieval to understand that the worst emergencies announced themselves quietly. She checked the monitors again. Looked at the pericardial ultrasound from his admission. There was fluid. Not much. Not enough to alarm on first inspection. But building. The monitor screamed at 0200 hours. Katie heard it from the med room where she was restocking 4 bags, that particular alarm tone that meant the pressure had tanked. Not the steady beep of a normal rhythm. The shrieking wail that meant someone was dying. She moved. The corridor tilted slightly under her feet as she rounded the corner toward bed 12, where the colonel lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with the ventilator's mechanical breath. The monitor showed systolic pressure at 94. Dropping. 87. The oxygen saturation was climbing, always a bad sign when it climbed without intervention. His body was compensating. Crashing. Katie grabbed the radio on her hip. Attending surgeon to ICU. Bed 12. Code blue. Static. No response. She tried again. Cardiology fellow to ICU. Stat. The radio stayed silent. 2 nurses covering 12 patients meant everyone else was drowning. It was Tuesday night at Oak Creek Memorial, and the ICU was running skeletal, understaffed by design, which meant understaffed by negligence, which meant someone was going to die while people who could have saved them were tied up somewhere else. Katie's eye scanned the monitor as she approached the bed. Systolic now at 72. The colonel's skin had taken on that particular grey-white quality that came with profound shock. His lips were already developing the faint bluish tint of hypoxia. His left arm lay at his side, and even unconscious, his fingers were curled slightly, as if still gripping something. As if still holding on. She had 17 minutes. Maybe less. Senior resident to ICU, she said into the radio. Bed 12. Emergency procedure. Still nothing. The footsteps came from the east corridor, fast, uneven, the gait of someone who was panicked but trying to run anyway. Dr. Chen appeared at the bedside, first-year resident, still soft around the edges, still believing protocols existed for reasons other than liability. His eyes went wide when he saw the monitor. "We need to," he started. "Pericardiocentesis," Katie said. She was already moving toward the ultrasound machine. The word hung between them like a blade. The pericardium's filling with fluid. Compressing the heart. Chen's face went the color of old concrete. "That's a physician procedure. We need to call the attending, we need to." "He'll be dead before they answer," Katie said flatly. She plugged in the ultrasound. The machine hummed to life, a small mechanical growl. "BP is now 62. That's your window." 10 minutes before his heart stops entirely. Chen stared at her. His hands were shaking. Young hands, unpracticed hands. Hands that had learned anatomy from textbooks and ultrasound simulations but had never actually placed a needle into a human thorax while watching the monitor countdown and knowing that if the needle went 2 centimeters to the left, it would puncture the myocardium itself. "I can't authorize that," Chen whispered. Katie met his eyes. "Then watch." She positioned the ultrasound probe at the 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process. The image resolved on the screen, the pericardial sac clearly visible, dark fluid pooling around the ventricle like an accusation. There it was. 8 months of being a nurse, of keeping her hands quiet and her eyes down, and now those hands needed to remember what they'd known how to do in Sanjin Valley when a Marine with shrapnel embedded in his chest had been bleeding out and the nearest surgical facility was 40 minutes away by helicopter and she'd been the only one with the training to keep him alive. Muscle memory was a lie and a truth simultaneously. It was the body remembering what the mind had tried to forget. Katie prepped the sterile field with the precision of someone running through drills, not someone improvising. Antiseptic, the sharp smell of it cutting through the recycled hospital air, gauze, drapes, a 14-gauge needle that would slide between the ribs like it was made for this exact moment. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid grace of someone who had done this before, and her voice was steady as surgical steel as she narrated each step for Chen, who stood frozen with his mouth open. "I'm using the ultrasound to avoid the left anterior descending coronary artery," Katie said. The words came automatically. Needle insertion at the 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process. Entering the pericardial sac now. The needle slid in. There was resistance, the pericardium was thick, designed to hold. Then it gave, and Katie drew back on the plunger. Blood filled the syringe. Thick, dark blood that had nowhere to go but out of the sac and into her hands. 100 cc. 150. 200 cc of blood that had been compressing the colonel's heart, keeping it from beating with enough force to perfuse his brain, his lungs, his organs. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The rhythm changed. Still elevated, still dangerous, but no longer the flat, failing line of a heart giving up. The oxygen saturation began dropping back to normal ranges. The blood pressure climbed. 74. 82. 91. Katie disposed of the needle into the sharps container with the same practice motion she'd used 1,000 times, and when she looked back at the monitor, the colonel's rhythm was holding. Holding. Chen was still standing there, his face the color of old porcelain. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician supervision. That's against protocol. That's saving his life," Katie said quietly. She didn't wait for his response. The colonel would need blood. 2 units minimum, maybe 3. Fluids to support his pressure while his body recovered from the shock of being one breath away from death. Medications, pressors, anticoagulants to prevent clotting around the intervention, pain management because even unconscious, the body knew it had been invaded. Katie was already calling for the blood bank, her voice calm and clipped like someone who had been giving orders in emergency situations long enough to forget that civilian hospitals had different hierarchies than military operations. Melissa arrived from the other side of the ICU, took in the scene, the exposed needle disposal, the ultrasound probe still in Katie's hand, and said nothing. Just nodded and began hanging the first unit of O-negative while Katie checked the colonel's pupils, his pulse, the warmth returning to his extremities. His eyes fluttered at 0400 hours. Just for a moment, barely conscious, barely present, but awake enough that something flickered behind his gaze. He stared up at Katie's face, really stared, as if trying to bring her into focus through the fog of sedation and trauma. His lips moved. No sound came out. His right hand, the one that could move, slowly lifted. His fingers traced the tattoo on his left forearm, the one that ran along his inner wrist, the letters faded now but unmistakable. Her name. Written in ink 12 years ago in a desert compound after a mission that had never officially happened, after a woman had carried him 3 miles through enemy fire and kept him breathing when his lungs wanted to give up. The recognition was written all over his face for exactly 2 seconds. Then the sedatives pulled him back under, and his hand fell away. Katie checked his vitals. Systolic 104. Diastolic 63. Heart rate 92. The numbers were still high, still reflecting the shock his system had endured, but they were numbers that meant survival. Numbers that meant his brain was getting oxygen. Numbers that meant the next 4 hours, the critical window before his kidneys, his heart, his lungs either recovered or began their final shutdown, those 4 hours had a chance of ending in something other than his funeral. She pulled up a chair. Not protocol. Not allowed. But the ICU was still empty, and the colonel had been one breath away from death, and Katie had learned a long time ago that sometimes the rules that mattered were written in blood, not in employee handbooks. 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes for the next 4 hours, she checked his blood pressure manually, listening to the soft whisper of the sphygmomanometer, feeling the faint thump-thump of his pulse under her fingertips. The pressure held. The saturation held. The rhythm held. At 0600 hours, as the first grey edge of sunrise began bleeding through the ICU windows, she transfused the second unit of blood and began adjusting the pressors, medications that would keep his heart strong, keep his brain perfused, keep his body from sliding into septic shock. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 0615 for morning rounds, and Katie was still standing at the bedside, her scrubs damp with sweat that smelled like copper and antiseptic, her eyes heavy with the particular exhaustion that came from holding someone else's life together on willpower alone. He reviewed the chart first, the behavior of a man who trusted charts more than people. His face darkened as he read. The blood transfusions. The pericardiocentesis order. The note in the chart, written in Katie's handwriting, that documented every step. You performed an invasive procedure without physician supervision. His voice was soft. That was always worse than yelling. Soft voices meant the anger was controlled, purposeful, surgical. Katie met his eyes. Her voice didn't waver. I saved his life. Hargrove stared at her for exactly 5 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and walked toward the hallway, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that constant, barely audible hum that Katie had learned to ignore weeks ago but which now sounded like a countdown. She could hear his voice from the corridor, crisp and authoritative, the voice of a man who had spent 20 years learning how to weaponize politeness. This is Dr. Hargrove. I need to speak to the hospital president. Yes, I'll hold. Katie turned back to the monitor, where the colonel's rhythm continued its steady, beautiful, impossible beeping. She noted the time, documented the vitals, and prepared for the 4 hours that would determine everything. The monitor's rhythm held steady through the darkness. 0247 hours. Katie documented each vital sign with the precision of someone who understood that numbers were the only language hospitals respected. O2 sat climbing. BP stabilizing. The colonel's chest rose and fell in synchrony with the ventilator's mechanical whisper. She had no idea what was about to arrive with the sunrise. By 0800 hours, the hospital president's office was already fielding calls. 3 board members. All before dawn broke over Houston. All citing the same concern, Katie Morrison's unauthorized practice during a code response. Her breach of protocol. Her scope of practice violation. The words were clinical. Intentional. They were also lies, but lies had institutional weight when they came from people with titles and investment portfolios. Dr. Hargrove had spent 20 years cultivating these relationships, dinners at Morton's, rounds of golf at the country club, strategic donations that bought influence like ammunition. One phone call at 05 for 5 hours, and 3 lawyers began building a file. The first-year resident, Chen, was pulled into Hargrove's office at 0930. Katie saw him emerge 30 minutes later with the pallor of someone who'd been threatened. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. He'd been there. He'd seen her save the colonel. He'd watched her hands move with the certainty of muscle memory, and now those same hands were being erased from the narrative. Chen found an excuse to reassign himself to pediatrics by lunch. Hargrove's voice had that effect on people. It was like a blade wrapped in velvet. You didn't realize you were bleeding until you tried to speak. At noon, an investigator from the State Licensing Bureau walked through the ER doors carrying a file thick as a medical textbook. Her name was Donovan. She had the look of someone who'd seen enough institutional corruption to know when the paperwork was manufactured. But she had her orders. Katie was pulled into the hospital attorney's office on the 4th floor, a room with mahogany furniture and a view of the parking lot that made everything feel smaller, less real. The allegations were read aloud like an indictment. Practicing medicine without a license. Falsifying credentials. Patient endangerment. Overriding physician authority. Katie listened to each one. Then she responded. The pericardiocentesis was performed under Emergency Protocol 7.2.3, section for nursing staff may perform emergency procedures when attending physicians are unavailable and patient death is imminent. I documented the procedure in real time. 2 witnesses present. The equipment was standard sterile technique. Credentials, the attorney asked, reading from a script Hargrove had written for her. Master's degree in critical care nursing, San Diego State University, 2011. Current RN license. BLS, ACLS, TNCC certifications. All current. Your references. Katie paused for exactly 1 second. San Diego State's nursing school has no record of a Katie Morrison graduating in 2011, the attorney continued, reading. Can you explain that discrepancy? She could. Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison's entire educational history had been written by the Navy. The civilian identity they'd built for her, Katie Morrison, nursing graduate, clean background check, no military service, it was a ghost document. Perfect for disappearing into a new life. Impossible to verify because it had never existed as anything but pixels in a classified database. If the attorney pulled the thread, the entire cover would unravel, and then federal agencies would arrive instead of investigators, and the word classified would shut down every conversation. Katie didn't say any of this. She said, I completed my degree through distance learning. The university may have records under a different surname. It wasn't a lie. It was the kind of misdirection you learned in SEER school: survival, evasion, resistance, escape. Give them a thread that goes somewhere else. Give them something to chase while you vanish. The attorney closed the file. Your employment is suspended pending investigation. You're not to return to this facility until cleared by hospital administration. Katie touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, Delta Force insignia, worn from a uniform she'd left behind 8 years ago. The patch was the only thing the Navy had forgotten to erase. It was sewn into the lining of a jacket she kept in her apartment, hidden in a drawer beneath civilian clothes, a piece of evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison had existed. That she had mattered. That she had saved people. But officially, she didn't. By 1600 hours, her nursing school references in San Diego were receiving calls from an investigator asking about Katie Morrison's instability, her pattern of aggressive decision-making, her unauthorized treatments. The references, confused, polite, said they had no record of anyone by that name graduating in their stated year. Of course they didn't. The Navy's cover had been built to be airtight until it needed to dissolve. Now, in one afternoon, it was dissolving perfectly. Katie packed her locker while nurses she'd worked with for 3 months avoided her eyes. They'd heard the story already, the fast version, the simplified version, the version that made her sound reckless instead of heroic. She folded her stethoscope, gathered her trauma shears. A few nurses had actually looked at her during shift change. Most hadn't. Institutional self-preservation was a powerful force. Being seen near her was becoming contagious. Melissa found her in the hallway outside the break room. The colonel's daughter, 12 years old, with her father's jawline and her mother's dark eyes. "You're leaving?" the child asked. Katie knelt to her level, meeting those eyes directly. "I have to." "But you saved him. You stayed for hours." "Mom said the monitor was bad and you didn't leave." Katie's composure held like a seawall against the tide. 12 years of military training, 8 years of civilian hiding, all of it engineered to prevent exactly this moment, a child asking her to stay. "Sometimes that's not enough," Katie said. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it away before standing. Before walking away. That same Friday evening, Katie sat in the VA hospital waiting room in Houston, but not as a provider. As a patient. She stared at the intake form's question about military service. Yes or no? Just 2 boxes. She was surrounded by veterans with missing limbs, burn scars traced like maps across brown skin, the 1,000-yard stare she recognized from mirrors. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something else, old coffee, resignation, the faint copper undertone of wounds that hadn't fully healed. A man with a prosthetic leg glanced at her, recognition flickering across his face like a match striking in darkness. "Helmand Province?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. She checked the yes box on the form and watched her hand write a name that wasn't hers. Katie Morrison. Age 34. No military service to list. No rank to disclose. Just another veteran pretending to be a civilian in a waiting room full of people who knew better. The waiting room air felt like water. Like she was drowning in plain sight while everyone around her watched the television, read outdated magazines, stared at nothing with the patience of people who'd learned how to wait for things that never came. The VA hospital waiting room dissolved when the monitor in the ICU down the hall started screaming. Katie heard it before she saw it, that particular frequency that meant cardiac decompensation, the sound that had muscle memory overriding conscious thought. She was moving before her brain caught up, her legs carrying her toward the chaos like they'd been waiting for months for exactly this moment. The nurses at the desk didn't stop her. They didn't even look up. The ICU was controlled pandemonium. A patient thrashing against restraints, a resident calling for medications, someone's monitor dropping into dangerous territory. And there, in the bed by the window, a man's eyes had snapped open with sudden recognition that hadn't been there that morning. The colonel's mouth moved, forming words his brain was still struggling to assemble. His left forearm, the one with the tattoo, the one that had never made sense to any of the other nurses, was tensing and releasing, as if his body remembered something his mind couldn't quite grasp. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the commotion from the next room over. Raw animal sounds, Pashto screaming in a voice that had been sedated for 3 days suddenly raw and conscious and terrified. Katie froze for exactly 1 second. 1. The sound pulled at something buried so deep in her chest she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't there anymore. The voice screaming was older now, scarred by years and displacement, but the fear in it was exactly the same as the fear she'd heard in Sanjan Valley when the Taliban commander had tried to overrun the northern checkpoint and she'd been the only thing standing between his men and the wounded soldiers behind her. She moved toward the colonel's room first. Priorities. The living present before ghosts. The colonel's daughter, Melissa, had jumped up from the chair where she'd been doing homework, her 12-year-old frame silhouetted against the window like a question mark looking for an answer. Her eyes went from her father's suddenly conscious face to Katie's name tag in one fluid motion, and something shifted in the room's pressure. Children see things adults have learned not to see. She whispered it like she was reading scripture. "Dad, what rank?" The colonel's voice came out broken, rebuilt from whatever circuits had just rewired themselves in his traumatic brain. 3 words that carried the weight of 18 hours in defensive positions under sustained fire, of extraction points and blood trails, and a woman whose hands had held his life together when everything else was falling apart. Senior Chief Petty Officer. His fingers rose slowly, trembling not with weakness but with the effort of remembering, and traced the letters on his forearm. Katie. The ink was faded now, blurred by years of sun exposure and scar tissue, but it was still there. Still legible. Still true. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. But something in her chest broke clean open like a walnut in a vice. She stepped closer to the bed and met the colonel's eyes, and in that moment both of them existed in Sanjin again, the heat, the dust, the weight of carrying each other through fire. Then a SEAL team leader in dress blues appeared in the doorway, out of uniform and out of jurisdiction but not out of purpose, and the moment shattered into something else entirely. The SEAL stepped forward with the precision of someone trained to deliver intelligence in hostile environments. His voice was steady, official, stripped of emotion but packed with weight like a magazine loaded with rounds. Senior Chief Morrison. He nodded once, just once, but the gesture carried the weight of recognition that no ceremony could manufacture. "I'm Commander James Briggs, Task Force 121, Colonel Rivera's command during the Sanjin deployment. I came to verify some facts for the federal investigators." He turned to face the assembled staff, the attending physician frozen mid-chart review, the residents staring like they were watching a language they didn't speak suddenly become intelligible. 2 silver stars. Pause. Space between words for impact. Navy Cross. Another pause. The room had stopped breathing. Purple Heart with 3 clusters. The attending physician actually sat down in the nearest chair. One of the residents whispered something that sounded like, "That's not possible," and Katie heard in that whisper all the ways they'd been taught to see her. Just a nurse. Just the quiet woman who made coffee and cleaned up after better people. Just someone to dismiss and diminish and use and forget. Commander Briggs continued, his voice dropping into territory that required security clearance to discuss. "There's a classified presidential commendation, but that documentation stays sealed." He looked directly at Katie then, and his eyes held something that looked like salute without the uniform. "The pericardiocentesis you performed at 0200 hours saved Colonel Rivera's life. The 4 hours you spent stabilizing his vitals prevented irreversible hypoxic brain damage. Every medical decision you made was not only sound, it was textbook special operations combat medicine. Better than textbook. Perfect." Melissa had moved to stand beside her father's bed, her small hand resting on his shoulder like she was anchoring him to reality. The colonel's eyes stayed locked on Katie's, and for the first time in the entire conversation, his voice came out clear. "She carried me." 3 words. The same 3 words he'd probably repeated every day of the last 18 years, the central fact around which his entire life had reorganized itself. Katie's name on his arm had been a question mark. Now it was an answer. Now it was truth. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the beginning of the worst part. The hallway filled then with the specific kind of chaos that only federal agents bring. Katie heard the boots before she saw them, not the soft rubber-soled steps of hospital personnel, but the heavy tread of people trained to occupy space and authority simultaneously. FBI windbreakers, 2 of them, one stepping toward the ICU station with a tablet in his hands and the kind of expression that came from 48 hours of surveillance footage. Agent Carr, his name tag would later read, though he introduced himself the way cops do when they're about to ruin someone's afternoon, "Dr. Hargrove, we need to speak with you in a private location. Now." Hargrove emerged from the staff lounge with coffee in hand, already making excuses before questions were asked. The tablet appeared, held steady like evidence at a trial. Katie could see the screen from where she stood: search history, access logs, database queries. Hargrove's face went the color of undercooked chicken. "Dr. Hargrove, we've been monitoring your computer access for 72 hours, Agent Carr stated, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a sentence that had already been written. You attempted to access classified military databases using Oak Creek Memorial's federal research credentials. You tried to cross-reference Katie Morrison against active duty personnel rosters. You searched for disciplinary records under names that don't exist anymore because those records were sealed at the highest level of government." The agent held up the tablet. Every search query was there. Every keystroke. Every moment Hargrove had spent trying to unravel a woman he decided was simple enough to destroy. "That's a federal crime, Doctor." The way he said it wasn't angry. It was administrative. It was final. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed like a fish removed from water. The coffee cup trembled in his hands, and the smell of it, bitter, burnt, cheaper than what he normally drank, seemed to underscore how far he'd fallen in the span of 72 hours. "I was verifying her credentials. She was performing procedures without proper." Senior Chief Morrison holds active credentials in combat medicine that exceed the qualifications of any civilian trauma surgeon in this hospital, Agent Carr interrupted, his tone suggesting this conversation had a predetermined endpoint and Hargrove's input was purely decorative. "She's authorized to perform emergency procedures that most of your surgical staff aren't cleared for. The pericardiocentesis she performed was not only appropriate, it was the only correct response to a life-threatening emergency that your attending physicians failed to identify." 2 additional federal agents appeared then, stepping out from the nursing station with the kind of synchronized precision that spoke to training and purpose. They weren't angry either. Anger would have been beneath the occasion. Hargrove tried to move toward his office, muscle memory suggesting that retreat was still an available option, but the agents positioned themselves like furniture, immovable, silent, inevitable. "I was protecting this hospital from someone practicing without transparency," Hargrove attempted, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone reaching for any argument that might stick. "I was following protocol. I was." "You were attempting to falsify federal personnel records," Agent Carr cut him off, his voice carrying the weight of 48 hours of documentation. "You were obstructing the civilian integration of a protected military asset. You accessed classified systems you had no authorization to access. You initiated a false investigation through the State Licensing Bureau using fabricated complaints." The agent's eyes were like surveillance cameras, recording, evaluating, documenting. "That's conspiracy. That's obstruction. That's attempted fraud of federal documents." The hallway had filled with an audience now. Residents and nurses and respiratory therapists and every person who'd been trained to see Katie as somehow less than, somehow suspect, somehow threatening to the order that Hargrove had spent 20 years constructing. They watched the understanding dawn across his face. The realization that he'd miscalculated so catastrophically that he'd ended his own career in the process of trying to destroy someone else's. Commander Briggs stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades making life-or-death decisions in impossible environments. The 4 hours Senior Chief Morrison spent stabilizing Colonel Rivera prevented brain damage that would have left him unable to recognize his own daughter. She made decisions under pressure that most surgeons would need a trauma bay and a full surgical team to attempt. She did it alone. She did it perfectly. And she did it after you'd already terminated her employment and filed federal complaints to ensure she could never work in medicine again. Melissa spoke then, her voice small but steady in a way that made her sound older than 12. She stayed when nobody else would. The colonel managed words again, each one a victory against the neural pathways that had been damaged when Hargrove's negligence nearly killed him. "She carried me." His fingers traced the tattoo again, this time with the recognition of someone who understood what that ink meant. Not just a name. Not just a memory. A debt. A salvation. A woman who'd been erased from every official record because the Pentagon had decided that was the price of her survival. Agent Carr produced handcuffs. Silver, professional, final. The sound they made when he opened them was like a key turning in a lock that could never be reopened. Dr. Hargrove, you're under arrest for unauthorized access to classified military systems, attempted falsification of federal records, conspiracy to obstruct a protected person's civilian integration, and federal crimes related to misuse of hospital research credentials. The handcuffs clicked. Just that. Click. The sound of one world ending and another beginning. Hargrove was led past Katie, past the nurses who'd testified against her, past the board members already calculating liability and distance and how quickly they could rewrite history to suggest they'd never trusted him anyway. Katie stood against the wall, her posture absolute, her eyes reflecting nothing but the fluorescent light of the ICU at 3 in the morning. One measured breath. The kind that comes from having already survived worse than this. 6 months later, Katie returned to Oak Creek Memorial wearing scrubs and a clarity that felt earned rather than given. Her civilian identity had been restored. Her records had been officially unsealed, then resealed, then marked with a stamp that meant she existed in government systems as a shadow, authenticated but invisible, credited but classified. The state investigation had cleared her in 48 hours once the FBI provided sufficient context. Hargrove's medical license was suspended pending criminal trial. Katie had heard through the grapevine of former residents that he was teaching CPR at Houston Community College for $15 an hour, arriving in a 15-year-old sedan with the flat effect of someone who'd learned too late what it meant to miscalculate an opponent's value. Colonel Rivera had recovered 70% cognitive function through a combination of time and neural plasticity and Katie's interventions during those critical hours when his brain was oxygen-deprived and desperate. Enough to remember Sanjin. Enough to remember Katie dragging him through gunfire with her leg bleeding through her fatigues. Enough to understand that the woman in the tattoo on his arm had been the only thing standing between him and death in 2 different centuries. Melissa sent Katie emails every week now, pictures of her father at soccer games, his speech improving incrementally, his hand steadier each month. The emails always ended the same way, "Thank you for staying." Katie kept them in a folder on her phone, never deleting them, reading them on shift breaks when she needed evidence that decisions made in darkness had consequences in the light. The former Taliban commander, Khalid Nazari, had been transferred to a federal medical facility after his asylum case moved through the preliminary hearings. His case file included testimony about the American female medic who'd treated his wounded brother even after taking fire from his defensive position. That contradiction, mercy from an enemy, survival from someone whose job was to kill him, would take years to unpack, if it could ever be unpacked at all. Katie had read his statement once, then closed the file. Some debts existed beyond the possibility of repayment. Some recognitions came too late to change anything except the future. She walked through the ICU at 2 in the morning, past sleeping patients, past the room where she'd performed the pericardiocentesis and changed everything about how the world was allowed to see her. A new first-year resident was struggling with a central line, his hands moving with the uncertainty of someone still learning the difference between procedure and intuition. Katie touched his shoulder. "I'll talk you through it." Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't carry apology or explanation. Just the steady competence of someone who'd performed this maneuver under conditions that would have broken most people. The resident listened, absorbed the instruction, and his hand steadied. Inside her jacket lining, the faded unit patch rested against her heart, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, the emblem of people who decided that duty meant something more than rank or recognition. On her forearm, still visible when she rolled her sleeves, a thin scar from Sanjin where shrapnel had torn through tissue and nerve. She didn't hide it anymore. The scar had become a credential, like the tattoo on the colonel's arm, like the name sealed in files that existed in the architecture of government but not in the public record. In the break room, someone had taped a printed quote to the wall, "Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark." Katie made coffee, added sugar, and returned to work. The night stretched ahead of her, full of patients who didn't know her story and didn't need to. They just needed her hands. They just needed her mind. They just needed someone who'd learned the difference between surviving and living, and had chosen to help them do both. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't know your value, like Katie was, share your story in the comments. And if you know a healthcare worker whose quiet heroism goes unrecognized, nominate them below. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the people who save us in the dark, the ones whose service extends far beyond any uniform we can see. Like this video if you believe heroes deserve recognition. Your story matters. It might save someone just by being told.